On weekday mornings, the city roared like a stadium without walls, and Liam Drift moved through it as if sound could not touch him. He mastered the art of the sideways glance, the shoulder turn that slipped past pub doorways spilling chants, the quiet refusal of screens that blazed highlights in shop windows. Jerseys were everywhere, clinging to strangers like flags. He watched his shoes, counted cracks in pavement, let the clamor roll over him and away. At the corner cafe, the barista tried every season to recruit him into conversation. "Big match tonight," she said, offering a smile with his coffee. He nodded without returning it. Her words faded, clipped by his silence. He sat in the deepest shadow of the room, beneath a television muted to protect him, while subtitles chattered about standings and records. He looked past the moving figures and found comfort in the condensation on his cup, the slow, honest bead of water becoming a small lake on the table, a geography only he could cross. He curated an algorithmic exile. He blocked names, hid tags, trained his devices to flinch away from anything shaped like rivalry. Ask him about books, he would answer. Ask him about weather, he might shrug. Ask him about the playoffs, and he would stare through you, not cruelly, but with the weary patience of someone guarding a wound. When co-workers argued about strategy in the break room, he lingered by the sink until someone changed the subject, then floated back to his desk like a leaf returning to still water. His apartment was a study in hushed air. One plant bowed toward the window, stubbornly green. A ceramic mug bore a crack thin as a hair. In the hall closet, beneath a winter coat he rarely wore, sat a shoebox taped along its seams, the tape yellowed and brittle. Some evenings he took it down, only to slide it back without opening it, as if the box exhaled a breath too cold to bear. Once, when the building shuddered from a crowd's cheer somewhere blocks away, he opened the lid a fraction and saw a glint of metal. He closed it quickly, the way a person shuts a door upon a storm. The city loved a man named Marcus Thorne. His face watched over intersections from billboards, a smile calibrated to promise victory without arrogance. Commentators called him a statesman of the field, an architect of dynasties. He cut ceremonial ribbons, shook dignified hands, lent his voice to causes that sounded like healing. Footage of him laughing with children played between commercials for shoes and energy, and even the cynical softened. Liam did not look up when Marcus's image passed on the side of a bus, yet something in his jaw flexed, a small muscle long forgotten. One afternoon the news followed him anyway. The cafe's muted television showed Marcus accepting an award named for endurance. Applause wavered across the room like heat. Liam felt it as pressure more than sound. He stood, abandoned his half-drunk coffee, and stepped into daylight that had learned how to glare. His reflection ran briefly beside the glass of a sports bar, then fell behind. He decided to walk home early, to outpace the day. The envelope waited in the hallway like a stray animal that had found his scent. No return address, no stamp beyond the minimum. His name hand-lettered in a script that looked almost careful. Inside, an old newspaper clipping, its edges feathered with age, released the smell of a forgotten library. The headline spoke of an inquiry into a minor league scandal from long ago, a tangle of accusations that had sunk without splash. Marcus Thorne's name did not headline. It floated in the third column, brief as a shadow. The piece mentioned a promising player whose career ended abruptly under suspicion. No names, only implications, only smoke curling toward a ceiling no one wanted to see. Liam carried the clipping to the kitchen light and read it twice, then held it at arm's length as if a different angle might erase it. A tremor crossed his fingers. He was practiced at refusing the world its games, at starving that particular part of his attention, yet the paper had found a door he thought he had bricked over. The words opened a corridor that smelled of sweat and varnish and winter breath. Behind his ribs, a locked room stirred. He returned the clipping to its envelope, then to the shoebox, then paused. The box remained open, inviting and cruel. There was the photograph he had avoided, edges bleaching toward white. A younger Liam with eyes like lit glass, shoulder to shoulder with teammates. A uniform that still remembered motion. On a shelf above, a trophy leaned, its nameplate dulled, letters nearly gone. He touched the metal and felt the cold leap up his arm. Outside, The crowd noise of a televised game swelled, then fell, like a tide negotiating the shore. He stood very still and let the sound wash the walls. Indifference had been his ballast, his chosen numbness, and for years it had held. Now, something old and urgent was tapping at it from underneath, clear as knuckles on wood. He lifted the clipping one more time, the paper thin enough to betray the veins of light behind it, and stared until the lines ceased to mean anything. Even stripped of sense, they continued to burn. Night pressed against the windows as if it had a heartbeat, and Liam sat in the kitchen with the envelope like a relic he could not sanctify or bury. Sleep came in stutters. When it did, it ferried him to a corridor of polished floors and winter breath, to a locker room glazed with the scent of leather and disinfectant. In the flash of memory, he saw himself younger, strides elastic, laughter quick as metal on a post. Marcus was there with that grin that always read as promise and dare, the kind that made coaches forgive and rivals overreach. They laced their shoes on the same bench, knees pointed like arrows, wrists taped with practiced, careless grace. The older men called them Thunder and Sky. Together they believed it. Those were days built on hunger. It hummed in lights that never cooled, in drills repeated until the world narrowed to muscle and breath, and the thin line between failure and a future bright enough to blind. Liam carried a quiet flame, a stubborn clarity that did not need applause. Marcus, even then, had ambition like a second skeleton, giving him shape when he trembled and crowding out anything softer. He charmed every room, absorbed praise until it hardened into expectation, and when he spoke of destiny, it sounded less like faith and more like a schedule. Pressure braided itself into them. Sponsors sniffed around like weather. Numbers decided whether they were invited to table or told to eat outside. On a night before a game that mattered beyond reason, they sat under a buzzing light and divided a bag of ice between knees that ached. Marcus leaned in, voice low. "Whatever it takes," he said, and the words landed at the bottom of Liam's stomach like a coin tossed into deep water. Liam nodded then, too loyal to hear the angle in it, too young to fear what kind of price might be hidden in the phrase. Morning scraped him back into the present. The city moved in confident loops. He tried to fold the clipping back into silence, but the mind, once stirred, is an unfaithful dog. He kept busy in the way the truly distracted do, with tasks that left his thoughts free to circle. By afternoon, the phone buzzed with a number he didn't know. He let it fade, then later found a voice message from a woman who introduced herself as Alara Vance, an investigative journalist. Calm, unhurried, she spoke as if each word had been weighed. She was examining an old controversy, she said, a thread that others had snipped short. She was hoping for context, perspective, anything he could offer. He did not return the call. His life had been arranged to avoid this exact gravity, and he felt himself already tilting toward it. The phone rang again the next day. He answered out of fatigue more than curiosity. "I think you knew people involved," she said, not pressing. "Sometimes the people nearest the blast don't hear it for the longest." "You've got the wrong person," he replied, too quickly, a flinch dressed as logic. "I don't follow sports." "It has a way of following the rest of us," she said softly. He hung up before her tone could soften anything in him. Alara did not disappear. She walked through archives where dust took its time returning to shelves, scanned microfilm that hummed like insects, and read minutes from meetings where men had congratulated themselves on managing optics. Pieces collected in her notebook. A footnote about a missing bottle from a team medical room. A line item for a private investigator hired by a sponsor. An internal memo time-stamped on the same morning a career ended. In footage from a forgotten regional broadcast, she found Marcus in a tunnel, his hand covering his mouth, speaking into the ear of a man who later rose to a position with the power to certify tests and bury results. Beside those frames, a still image captured Liam in the distance, head down, shoulders squared against a wind that was not weather. She stumbled on a file once misfiled under maintenance requests. A lab report corrected in a different handwriting, letters carved like they were trying to masquerade as their own shadows. The sample number, she realized with a pulse of adrenaline, matched the date of a game that became infamous for reasons the public never fully learned. In a closed forum for retired staff, she read a recollection from a trainer who, anonymously and finally, wrote that a quiet kid with lit glass eyes had been marked. The phrase was too specific, too precise to be coincidence. When she called again, she left no argument, only a detail that reached across years like a hand. You kept a strip of black tape inside the left cuff because the stitching irritated the bone when it swelled, her voice said to the quiet of his kitchen. And on the night before it all broke, Marcus told you, head like water, and tapped the bench twice. You tapped back once because your finger was already numb. The phone ended its lighted work. The room was very still. He could feel the old tape, brittle under his thumb. The memory jolted so cleanly he almost looked down to see the cuff. A shape he had been holding shut for years shifted, and something colder than rage slipped into his breath. Not a blaze, but a current. Indifference had been armor. Now it clanged, useless, as he pictured the way Marcus's knuckles had sounded against that bench. Ordinary wood singing the first note of a song he had refused, until now, to hear. He opened the door before she could knock a second time. Alara stepped in with the restraint of someone crossing a chapel, then set a slim folder on the table. Paper whispered, as she arranged proof into a single, merciless line, a lab report with figures overwritten in a new hand. A maintenance log noting a lock replaced outside the medical room. A still image from a tunnel where Marcus leaned into a man later given authority over tests. A transfer receipt to a private consultant at midnight. Last came a clipped recording from a dead pager network. A voice saying, low and pleased, that the chain would be soft tonight, and that a certain saint would be grateful. She did not dramatize. She only turned each page, letting the implications lift like smoke. Accident was not a word left on the table. He watched his past become coordinates and invoices. The private language of betrayal translated into entries anyone could read. A muscle jumped in his jaw. The rest of him stayed very still, as if stillness were the only dignity left. The room softened at the edges, and the wall he had built let through a single, ungovernable scene. He tasted the corridor's damp air again, lights fizzing, boots skittering grit. Marcus tapped the bench twice, their old signal, and smiled with a warmth that asked for trust and nothing more. Head like water, he murmured. Let it carry you. In the locker room, a trainer pressed a fresh bottle into Liam's hand because the first had vanished. The plastic had a sweetness he told himself was electrolytes. After the match, the collector arrived with his numbered vials and practiced neutrality. Liam did what he had been trained to do, never seeing the second set of seals tucked in a pocket, the text already sent to a fixer standing by. In a lab of humming lights, a tired technician signed chain of custody lines, while a certifying official stopped in, and the numbers on a report shifted by a degree that would ruin a life. Days later, a conference room smelled like coffee gone bitter. Words such as metabolite and adverse profile landed with the surety of verdicts. Cameras flashed while Marcus stood behind him, a hand on his shoulder that looked like solidarity and felt like weight. The fall happened in cruel increments. A sponsor severed ties before lunch. A coach's message softened into silence. Friends practiced neutrality, as if it were virtue. Headlines compared him to others already buried. At home, his father's quiet found hooks in every corner. His mother pressed tea into his hands and aged between sips. A niece asked why the television did not show him anymore, and he told her the game had changed because the truth would have broken something tender. He put the trophies in a box, then learned to put entire conversations in boxes too. He stopped lingering near screens, orchestrated routes that kept him from bars on game nights, tuned his life to avoid an accidental scoreline. Apathy became a discipline masquerading as personality. He let others praise the purity of competition and did not mention the smell of corridors where reputations were traded like chips. Not caring was cleaner than constant argument. It dulled the nerve that connected memory to meaning. If the city treated sport like scripture, his defiance was not blasphemy, so much as fluent silence. He taught and retaught himself not to look up when a cheer rose, because a glance could unearth a body he had buried. Now the present returned with the dry rasp of paper and Alara's measured breath. She told him the consultant had admitted, for money and distance, that the chain was softened by design. She played a muffled exchange in which Marcus's name was replaced by titles that only pointed one way. She showed a ledger where donations flowed to discretionary funds the week a lock was changed. "We can prove intent," she said. "It could clear you and start the unmaking of what he built." He nodded once. "Tell me where to begin," he said, eyes cold with intent beyond vindication. Alara laid a map of names and dates on his kitchen table, paper corners catching on old mug rings. He watched her stitch connections with a steady hand until the file had a pulse. He offered what he had kept buried. Which locker rooms had unnumbered keys, which officials called late, which charities appeared when a test needed mercy. They moved through the city like patient trespassers. A former assistant coach met them in deep shade, and, in careful fragments, described a donor who materialized whenever a season bent toward miracle. A lab clerk, now selling appliances, trembled as he recalled a night when the chain of custody box was opened, resealed, and followed by a message containing his daughter's school. Liam told him the courage to remember was the start of undoing a wrong that had never been his. Marcus's shadow slid across their work. Emails evaporated from mirrored archives. A source canceled with cheerful texts, and by morning was boarding a flight. A smear piece sprouted insinuations about Alara's past reporting. Liam learned someone had pulled his credit history 6 times in a week, a paper whisper that still carried teeth. The cost of silence surfaced everywhere. A physiotherapist dismissed for refusing to alter a report rented a basement with a ceiling low enough to brush. A sprinter framed for a missed test drove nights and kept medals in a shoebox because walls felt like a dare to fate. Each confession straightened Liam's posture, not with rage alone, but with a sober purpose. He felt the old reflex to look away rise like a tide. He let it pass. Rejecting the spectacle of sport had once protected him. Rejecting people would only repeat the wound. Alara noticed the way he occupied space again. He argued over timelines, proposed sharper questions, and called out inconsistencies with a calm that carried weight. Between interviews, they developed a shorthand of glances. Rest, caution, go now. Trust grew in increments. He told her about the last morning he believed in fairness, and she told him about the first time she learned truth does not win without company. The proof they needed hid behind layers of deniability until a clerical error cracked the shell. An invoice to a sham consultancy listed a device serial number. Liam recognized the pattern used by the team's training servers years ago. Alara traced it to a storage facility run by a media management firm that handled event footage and compliance backups. Inside that archive, tucked between promotional cuts, lived voice notes from after-action reviews, an unguarded habit of a man who rehearsed victory to himself. One recording bore the week of Liam's collapse. Marcus's voice, low and satisfied, described a chain adjusted, a rival neutralized, a donor thanked. He laughed once, not loud, but with ownership. The archive was not theirs to touch. It sat in a climate-controlled room behind a biometric gate, its access governed by non-disclosure agreements and private guards who owed favors to Marcus's allies. Copies existed only as mirrored shards across servers rented under bland corporate names. Permissions led to one terminal that could export without flagging, a workstation in the firm's executive suite used late at night by an editor who watched games at double speed. Alara outlined the risks in a voice stripped of drama, and he felt how hope makes rooms tilt when you admit it aloud. His indifference had once been armor. Now purpose felt like a blade he knew how to hold. They sketched a path as plain as it was terrifying. Reach the terminal, pull the recording with metadata intact, walk out before alarms caught up. No clever quote would save them if they failed. Only timing, restraint, and an exit no one noticed. Liam looked at the printouts, then at Alara, and something settled, not calm exactly, but a decision heavy enough to steady his hands. He nodded once, and in the small sound the house made when pipes shifted, he heard the world making room. They went after closing, when the lobby's marble cooled and the security desk flickered without a watcher. Alara kept her badge buried. Tonight, anonymity felt like armor. Liam moved with that careful economy of someone who once belonged to rooms like this. The air tasted metallic, the climate cold as a vault. They passed posters of athletes frozen mid-roar, a museum to victory's surface, and slipped into the executive suite where the lone terminal hummed. Alara exhaled, count of 1. Liam spoke softly to the machine, fingers remembering the logic of permissions like a song missing words. The index opened, and there it was, a week stamped in bruised numerals. He pulled the file, metadata intact, slid a copy to their drive, and wiped traces they had touched. Somewhere, a latch sighed. They left by a service stair, feet measured, hearts loud enough to mistaken for alarms. By dawn, the plan had edges. They would time the release to the opening ceremony of a championship broadcast, that cathedral where Marcus would stride on stage for a lifetime honor, cameras hungry, crowd rehearsed. Alara mapped distribution with a surgeon's calm, mirrored uploads, partner publications queued, a failsafe tied to regular check-ins. She secured an independent lab to verify fingerprints in real time. Liam wrote a statement without varnish, listing harms and names that had never been allowed a microphone. He did not need the arena, only witnesses who would not look away. The irony sat beside him like a cat. He would use the noise he had rejected to deliver something quiet and irrevocable. Purpose hummed where fandom once went to die. Marcus moved faster than rumor. By midday, a glossy editorial smeared Alara as vindictive and sloppy, its quotes bought with fresh retainers. A courier left a letter at Liam's sister's door, threat braided with civility. A black sedan idled across from their building, windows tinted to the color of denial. An intrusion rattled their cloud, a sudden rush shaped like a hand through curtains. But the recordings lived in more places than ambition could track. Alara had hashed and notarized them, pinned timestamps to a neutral ledger, sealed geolocations with an auditor who did not watch sports at all. The pressure found Liam's sleep. He woke tasting iodine and chalk, locker room ghosts pressing close. Alara stood beside the bed and said, "You are here." And the room remembered its windows. On the morning of the ceremony, he nearly folded. Billboards blazed with faces and trophies, a carnival of wanting, and the softest voice inside him suggested the gentlest mercy was disappearance. He stood at a sink in a borrowed room, water running loud, and met the man in the mirror who had made indifference a sanctuary. The quiet had kept the world from touching him, and kept him from touching it back. He did not need to love what hurt him to love the truth about it. He dried his hands, tucked the statement into his jacket, and chose to walk toward the noise without surrendering himself to its demands. Marcus intercepted him in a velvet corridor, the air dense with floral money. "You won't win," he said, already smiling for a passing lens. Liam met the smile without heat. "I did when I stopped letting you define silence." Marcus's eyes thinned. "Everyone loves a champion. Until they hear him alone." The smile dropped like a curtain. When the lights rose and the anthem swelled, the screens broke script. A waveform bloomed across the stadium, and Marcus's own voice filled the air, calm and unmistakable, describing a chain adjusted, a rival neutralized, a donor thanked. Metadata scrolled in sober fonts. Publications pushed the dossier live in tandem. The cheer curdled into a sound with no name. Sponsors blinked off in a row like city blocks losing power. Security swarmed. Cameras multiplied. Statements drafted themselves and fell apart. Alara's phone lit like a storm. Liam felt neither triumph nor collapse, only a door unlocking. The battle was public. The war would be personal, and long. The days after the broadcast unfolded like a slow avalanche, a public unmaking that nobody could stop once it began. Sponsors detached themselves with language polished to a mirror shine, speaking of values they had ignored until the lights made denial impossible. Boards convened emergency sessions behind tinted glass, and longtime allies excused themselves into silence. The investigations multiplied. One committee chased the money, another the medical records, a third the private communications that had sounded so confident when they believed no one was listening. Marcus tried a familiar smile on a morning show and found it returned to him as pity. By week's end, the Federation vacated his titles, the endorsement contracts dissolved, and a prosecutor announced charges with a voice that did not tremble. Liam watched most of it with the sound off. He read the formal letter, clearing his name, and touched the embossed seal like a relic that finally remembered its purpose. An apology followed, awkward and incomplete, delivered by people who had learned contrition as choreography. He did not need them to be eloquent. He needed the record to tell the truth when his lips were tired. He slept through a dawn without that old bolt of dread, and when fear came sneaking, it found fewer places to anchor. Ilara moved through the aftermath with measured grace, intercepting calls meant to exhaust him, deflecting flattery that smelled like entitlement. In quiet hours, they cooked with the windows open, and he found that chopping an onion required a kind of attention nothing else could borrow. She asked him what he wanted to want. He said, "Not to be dragged by the same rope that once hauled me to the podium." He said, "To care for people more than for outcomes." He said, "To let a season be nothing but weather." They met with other survivors whose careers had been broken to make way for someone else's legend. In a borrowed office that still smelled like old copy paper, they placed coffee and notebooks in a circle and listened. Liam spoke less than he thought he would, more than he could have imagined a month before. He helped establish a fund for whistleblowers that would pay rent for the months when truth made you unemployed. He wrote guidance on documentation that read like an invitation to be brave, then practical again. Ilara built an archive of testimonies, verified and anonymized, so patterns could be mapped, so denial had to step aside for data. He did not return to stadiums, and if crowds roared on a television in a diner, the sound thinned to something harmless. His refusal was no longer a barricade against pain. It was a decision to direct his energy elsewhere. He began to restore old violins in a sunlit room above a print shop, learning the stubbornness and soft surrender of wood. There was a patience in sanding that resembled forgiveness, and a precision in fitting a bridge that felt like telling the exact truth without ornament. He labeled each instrument with the date it sang again. When he finally addressed an audience, he chose a community hall where folding chairs creaked like honest bones. He spoke about being measured until the measurement became him, about making apathy a shield when the world mistook hunger for goodness. He said that indifference can be wisdom when it keeps you from worshiping the wrong altar. He said that walking away is not failure if you are walking toward your life. People listened with the kind of stillness that has weight. A young athlete asked how to know when ambition is eating you. Liam told him to check whether joy is still invited to practice. News traveled that Marcus had surrendered his passport, and eventually, his freedom. The headlines lost their fever and became case numbers. Liam felt less vindication than quiet. A rearranging of furniture in a room he hadn't entered in years. He called his sister from a park bench and heard children playing a game with rules they made up as they ran. When she asked what came next, he said, "Not a return, a beginning." With Ilara, the bond that had been forged in crisis settled into something steady and tender. They argued about commas and laughed about supermarket fruit, trusted the other to call them back from the edge of overwork. They designed a workshop for journalists and athletes on the craft of verifying what power prefers to blur, offering checklists and earplugs, and the simple practice of writing down how a room felt. At night, they shared a silence that did not threaten either of them, the safe quiet of two people who could speak whenever they wished. On a late afternoon washed with amber, Liam bent over a violin whose top plate had split along a line as fine as an old lie. He traced the break with a fingertip and set the clamp with a care that bordered on reverence. Beyond the window, a street game broke into laughter at a disputed score, the argument already dissolving into play. He smiled without looking up, hearing only the soft ascent of wood and glue, feeling the tremor of a note about to be born. The echoes that once kept him numb were gone, replaced by a music he was learning to make and to share. Not for trophies, not for proof, but for the simple fact of being alive.